moment.
Unless there's something else you want to discuss here?
No, I think Sainath and I had a chat in the morning, so we're good to go.
All right.
And yeah.
All right.
So, Gilsab, can you just check on the Facebook? Are you on the Facebook?
No, I'm not. I can check. It's not coming here. It will come Facebook Live.
Not yet. It's not connected.
Okay, let me try again.
What I'm proposing to do, Sainath and Priti, is I will, after I do the introduction, Sainath starts speaking, I'll switch my video off so that you can highlight just him. Nobody else needs to be there. That's my own thought. But
yeah, I think that's good. Arvinderji, please, keep the spotlight, yes.
Yeah.
So that we can't see everyone on the little boxes.
I will, but I think probably again today something is going wrong with the Facebook. Say something about this video. Okay, got it. Yeah. So it's streaming now.
Yes.
3, 2, 1, and go. So we are on the recording and we are live on the Facebook now. So you can continue.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah.
Good evening and welcome to the MAJHA House Conversations, where every month we try and make sense of the mainstream and the marginal in contemporary India. And today our guest is P SAINATH, Magsaysay Award winner and writer and journalist. And he is going to talk to us about mass media versus mass reality, agrarian distress and the compulsion to lie. I just had a few points to make before I hand over to Sanjoy to take the conversation forward, to take the talk forward. And so I'll do that right now when I have a bit of time with you. Today is October the 2nd. It's Gandhi Jayanti. It's a national holiday. It's a day to mark one of our tallest leaders, someone who led India to freedom, someone who led some of the most historic movements to challenge British might, someone who believed in non-violence, in religious pluralism, in secularism, in the strength of being self-reliant, in giving back dignity to the poor, the oppressed, and those who had been cast aside, to the marginalized, and those who had been made voiceless. Gandhi believed in non-violence. He believed in the power of peaceful mass movements. He was perhaps the tallest leader of Indian peasantry and of the Dalits and of the Muslims. And he was able to, by sheer force of his actions and of his personality, create a solidarity between these social segments. He was able to bring them together in a fundamental way. Despite the fact that he was born and raised in Gujarat in an Orthodox Baniya family, in his life and work, he was conspicuously free of any sort of provincialism. In South Africa, he worked alongside Hindus, Muslims, Parsis, Christians, Jews. And when he returned, he toured the length and breadth of the country and developed deep connections with all provinces and linguistic groups. And so it was with Punjab in that crucial year, 1919. His visits there transformed him and made him an implacable opponent of the British. The All India Hartal against the Rowlatt Act, his journey to Punjab's country, all through Punjab's countryside in November and December 1919, taking statements on martial law, on what had just happened in April, the Jallianwala massacre, and other instances of repression established him and also made him stand out as a national leader who was creating linkages and creating connections with people throughout our vast country. The Akali movement was also the first successful demonstration of passive resistance, which was organized by the Sikhs to dislodge the Mahants and the priests and those who had taken over the Sikh shrines. It was in the wake of the Akali movement that the Sikh peasantry of Punjab came out in the open against British rule. And it was also a connection that was made with Gandhi and with his Satyagraha. But where do we stand today? Have the dreams of our founding fathers and founding mothers come to pass? I just wanted to cite a couple of things. There have been violent acts against the weak, against women, against Dalits, against minorities. The agriculture bills have been passed without discussion, leading to the peasantry once again out on the streets. And in the midst of a pandemic, what is our media concentrating on? What are the shallow concerns and petty things that the media is after? I don't think I need to elaborate further on that. I also wanted to just, there were a couple of other things that came up when I was looking at some material this morning. And I read that a protest meet had been planned at India Gate today for the 20-year-old woman from Maharashtra who was brutalized and murdered. But it was banned because of the imposition of Section 144. Farmers organizations have announced Bharat Bandh today against the farm bills, which of course have already been passed. And let me end on a more grand note. On this 150th birth anniversary of the Mahatma, the father of the nation, Indian missions have arranged LED video projections on his philosophy at 120 locations around the world, including at iconic landmarks like Piccadilly Circus in the UK and the Burj Khalifa. The storyline being projected is that the relevance of his life and his beliefs, it is still relevant today in this world and to the youth of today. So I think it's a really significant time, and it's against all of this and against this very background that Sainath is going to speak to us, and I'm most grateful for that. He has the data, he has the figures, he has the stories, and he's been reporting on rural India and its many inequalities for decades. He will provide coherence and perhaps also a moral compass to guide us through these concerns. His iconic book, Everyone Loves a Good Route, is in its 50th printing and a Penguin classic. But more than that, it has served to open our eyes to inequality, to prejudice, to injustice, indifference, apathy, corruption. I'd like to welcome you, Sainath and Sanjoy, and request you to please take this evening forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Preeti, for the words of welcome and the words of concern and the words of shall we say, deep and abiding, for lack of a better word, pressure that lies all around us and the challenges which lie around us. Welcome everybody to the this first MAJHA House dialogue. Palagummi Sainath, forgive me Sainath if I pronounce it incorrectly, is our opening speaker, the opening bat of the series, and speaking on agrarian distress and the compulsion to lie. If I was to describe Sainath in an earlier time, one would call him a development journalist. But he is much more than that. He's much taller than that, and he's has much more depth and power, as we shall see and hear today from his conversation. We are actually marking the anniversary of two great Indian leaders. One was Mahatma Gandhi, as Preeti said, the other is Lal Bahadur Shastri, whose days fall today. And just 4 days ago, the 28th of September was Bhagat Singh's birth anniversary. Sainath focuses on social and economic inequality, on rural issues of poverty in the aftermath of globalization in India. He was very keen that I speak about the People's Archives of Rural India, PARI, which he has founded and is editor with his wonderful team. He's also a senior fellow for Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. We all know about the Magsaysay Award that he won in 2007 for his extraordinary journalism, and by being able to go to the heart of the rural crisis with his path-breaking book, Everybody Loves a Good Drought. Those were the findings and the combination of 84 articles that he had written in 2 years for the Times of India in the districts of Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, Orissa, Madhya Pradesh, and Chhattisgarh. And he continues today to plow his lonely furrow because his is a powerful and relentless coverage over the past 20, nearly 30 years of the agrarian crisis that has continued in India. It's won him no less than 6 international and rural and national awards. But as I said, although he plows a lonely furrow, he is not the only tiller. He has a team. He sets a high standard of reporting and research in a cracking pace. And I would call him not a development journalist, but an investigative journalist and essayist. And he is a person, an individual for whom I have deep and abiding respect, not just for the fact that he spends more than 70% of his time in rural India reporting, as he always has done, from the field, finding the real news, the real stories, and the truth behind the headlines. So it is with great pleasure that I welcome Sainath to deliver his talk at MAJHA House. As always, you have a very attentive national and international audience, Sainath. I want to close by saying that, PARI, is the People's Archives of Rural India is not just a creation, it is also a legacy. And I thank you for joining us, and I welcome you to address the gathering. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sanjay and Preeti. I'm quite delighted and honored to be here. I thank the organizers. Today being October 2, Gandhi Jayanti, I was just sharing with the organizers before we went live. From 5 a.m. to 1 p.m., 5 a.m. this morning to 1 p.m. this afternoon, the top trending tweet on Twitter was Nathuram Godse Zindabad. This, tells you about one aspect of media, social media. And this was so clearly a paid for, coordinated, organized onslaught. Organized by people who know how to work Twitter's algorithm and who have the wherewithal to have thousands and thousands of people tweeting on it. A completely contrived exercise. After 1 p.m., the more humane and pro-Mahatma tweets took over. But this was the trending tweet from 5 a.m. or 5:30 a.m. to 1 p.m. The subject we have today before us is a very large one. I'm going to try dividing it into 4 sections and hope I'll be able to do justice to them. Let me begin with the media and farmers on September 25th, when you had the nationwide protest by farmers. I emphasize the word nationwide because a significant chunk of the media has tried to say that this is really about Punjab and Haryana, and maybe a bit of Western UP. That is not so. Not only did the protests begin everywhere, led by Punjab and Haryana, that is true, they are still going on to the extent that the Chief Minister of Karnataka is undertaking a district after district tour to pacify farmers, because there too, these issues that the farmers of Punjab and Haryana took the initiative on are getting mixed up with other issues locally in the legislature. But all these issues have one thing in common. They are anti-corporate protests. They are protests against the corporate onslaught on Indian agriculture, against family farming. Remember, the one thing that distinguishes the attack on farming, on the farming sector, from the attack on all the other sectors, health, education, etc. Here, you're not dismantling some public sector. Farming is the largest private sector in the country, the largest employer in the country. You are clearly showing us what neoliberalism means. You're smashing the country's largest private sector for a takeover by a monopoly corporate sector. So what happened on 25th? It's also interesting on 25th how the government tried to undermine any possible media coverage. They didn't really have to, because most of the media, as you know, are so clearly with the government. But to make sure that the farm protests were sidelined in media coverage, at least on television, the government on that day, they organized the Election Commission of India's announcement of the dates of the Bihar election. Okay. Now those dates had clearly been decided on a couple of weeks ago, but they decided to put them out on September 25th because the farm protests were going to be hogging some attention. Second, the Narcotics Control Bureau created its own news cycle that day. Deepika Padukone stuck at the Goa airport trying to reach back to Delhi. Karishma Prakash of Prasad, her secretary, summoned to the NCB so that the entire media were parked outside the Narcotics Bureau. And still, the protests of farmers happened in state after state. I was in touch the whole day with farm groups in many different states. In Maharashtra, where I'm based, more than 50,000 people came out on the streets in different parts, not a small thing during a pandemic. There were 10,000 to 12,000 people on the Mumbai, Baroda, Jaipur, Delhi highway. Tamil Nadu, 22,000 arrests of picketers. And as you know, maybe 30 to 40% of protesters might be arrested. So we assume that the total protesters were well over 40,000. There were 22,000 arrests of people picketing. Karnataka, every single district plus the cities. Bengaluru had 2 major rallies in 4 days, apart from which Davangere, Mangalore, Bengaluru, the Tumkur, Mysore, all Hubli, Dharwad, all these places saw farmers coming out in strength to protest. Go and look at the web pages of the major Kisan organizations, like for instance, the All India Kisan Sabha, its national level page and this. You will see photos from incredible numbers of venues. The third thing done on that day, the third meet, there was only 10 minutes. I mean, one NDTV was showing the protests. The others were occasionally saying, here's something that happened on the Haryana-Delhi border or whatever like that. The one time that every channel for 10 minutes was on the agriculture issue was, of course, when the Prime Minister came to speak and denounced all those who were opposing his bills. But equally interesting, farmers, unlike the Nathuram Godse followers, don't have paid trolls and no social media, teams and armies. And yet, that day, out of the top 10 trends on Twitter, number 1 to 4 were about farmers' protests, and overwhelmingly, middle class tweets expressing sympathy with the farmer. So all was not lost, but that's how your media function, and we'll come to why. Oh, incidentally, Gandhi, twice in his major arrests, once before at the time of the sedition trial, and then several other times, when putting down his occupation, identified himself as a farmer and a weaver, two of those livelihoods that worried him so deeply. He identified himself as farmer and weaver. He wasn't actually. He was a non-practicing barrister, and by the way, a prolific practicing journalist. But that was his identification. Now, very briefly about the 3 bills which are now laws, because I get hundreds of mails each day asking, but isn't it a good thing? Farmers are being given a choice. They can go out and sell. I'm going to deal with these bills briefly because we need to really connect it to the larger sources of agrarian distress. The bills haven't come out of the blue. They are a further step down the road we set out on in 1991. So what about the bills? The first of these, the Farmers Produce Trade and Commerce Promotion and Facilitation Act, also simply meaning about the APMCs, the Agricultural Produce Marketing Committees. It's astonishing that the APMCs have been painted as some sort of center of the evil empire, enslaving farmers, which raises the question of why all these stupid farmers going out and defending their APMCs, right? The APMC was never an evil empire. The APMC was never, ever a monopoly. What choice? As of today, the last data available from the National Sample Survey Organization, more than 65% of paddy is sold in private trade, not in the APMCs. Nearly 60% of wheat is in the private trade, not in the APMCs. And we are all going after these APMCs as if they are holding farmers and the agricultural trade to ransom. The fact is, APMCs have never had a monopoly of agricultural surplus that's marketed. The fact is that the bulk of produce of the farmer is lost at the farm gate because of the farmer's indebtedness, because of the farmer's pledge to sell to the sahukar, to the trader, to the commission agent well in advance. Most of that crop is parted with at the farm gate, not in the APMC. But for middle class viewers and audiences, let me try explaining this APMC with an analogy which I think all of us would easily understand. Take government schools, okay? I would say that government schools are the APMCs of the education sector. Look at government schools. They're inadequate. They're underfunded. They're problematic. Many of them don't have a proper blackboard. Huge numbers of them do not have toilets for girls. There are some of them which have no toilets at all, no functioning toilets at all. They are problematic. They're inadequate. They're insufficient. But because they exist, tens of millions of poor children who would never otherwise be able to go to school get to go to school, and tens of millions of poor children get one decent meal a day at those schools. Under the pandemic, under the lockdown, malnourishment has gone up. And by the way, even before the pandemic, I should tell you that once I was accosted by a large group of teachers in the Adivasi stronghold districts of Thane in Maharashtra. And they had a strange demand which they were making on behalf of the students. So they told me, you're supposed to be this big shot journalist. Can't you make this one demand for us? What was the demand? Midday meal ration should be double on Monday. On Mondays, they should be double ration. Why Mondays? Because they explained to me, the child has not had a morsel of worthwhile food since the Friday midday meal. No teacher is willing to teach before 12 noon and the lunch bell in the school. As one of them told me, there's too many burning bellies in the classroom for us to be able to address any young minds. Okay? The government schools are inadequate, insufficient, all of that. Take them away, what will happen? The PHCs and district hospitals can be called the APMCs of the health sector. Yeah. If in all your farm distress, in all your agrarian distress, one of the greatest features of those farm households in distress, especially the 330,000 plus households that have seen farmers' suicides, especially in those, you will find that health expenditures are gigantic. And indeed, health expenditures in this country are in most regions, are either the fastest or the second fastest growing component of rural family debt. And farmers sink in that debt. It's a sahukar debt to be able to send your mother to the hospital or your daughter operated somewhere or whatever. Okay. So we all know how irritating the primary healthcare centers are. We all know how obnoxious the district hospitals can be. Would you advise breaking them down, shutting them down and saying, hey, let's give the kids a choice. Why don't they go to DPS or modern school or Vasant Valley or Heritage School or Inventure Academy? They got a choice. The APMCs are like that in Indian agriculture. They are inadequate, they are insufficient, but at this moment, indispensable. They came to fight monopolies, not to exercise one. And as I told you, you can look at all the crops under MSP and see in which of them the APMC has 60% or over 50% of the marketable surplus. Do you know that as you and I are speaking, farmers in Kalahandi in Odisha are pledging to the Sahukar the crop of 2023. They are pledging the crop of 2023 because you know what the problem is? You have to eat in 2020. You can't wait till 2023. They've already pledged the crops of 2020, 2021, 2022. The only thing they can now pledge is crop of 2023. The private stranglehold over these small and marginal farmers who form the overwhelming bulk of Indian agriculture, Indian agriculturists, is really, that is the monopoly you need to fight. Now we are breaking it down through these laws to let the corporate sector come and create a little more havoc. Let me tell you that the so-called new law has already existed and been implemented in at least different parts of the country. In Maharashtra, the Vashi APMC is working exactly on the model of the new laws since 2015. In Bihar, that state did away with its APMC Act in 2006. In Kerala, they've never had an APMC Act. And yet, nowhere have major private retailers come and rescued the farmer or any such thing. In fact, they are now with the second act, the Essential Commodities Amendment Act. They are in a position, since all the restraints on their stockpiling have been removed, they're in a position to put together, hoard huge quantities of produce, push the farmer's price down on the one hand and the market price up on the other. This was essentially why the Essential Commodities Act came into place, to stop that kind of racketeering, which, by the way, will affect the middle classes very severely. Now, I'll dispense with the Essential Commodities Amendment Act in 2 lines. Essentially, the new Essential Commodities Act tells you that none of these things are essential anymore, and say that you can only treat them as essential under extraordinary circumstances like war and famine. And then something has to cross 100% over the earlier retail price for it to come to attract attention. Okay, so that's the second one. The third is the so-called Contract Act, which doesn't even recognize that 95% of tenancies, for instance, in this country, are based on unwritten contract. Now, this bill that yammers on about written agreements does not mandate written agreements. Nowhere. By the way, none of these 3 bills mentions the word MSP or minimum support price. They're not about those at all, as the government itself has said so. Okay? So the third one is the contract, which legitimizes the extremely unfair bargaining situation between small peasant farmers and big traders and big players. So that's all. This was happening earlier. Okay, now it's been given an institutional legislative framework, and you can ask me about it if you want on that. But your larger agrarian crisis, and incidentally, the ignorance of the media, you will not find too many editors, who don't use the word agrarian and agriculture interchangeably. Strictly speaking, they are different terms. Okay, agrarian crisis is a much later stage than a crisis of agriculture. So, to just be a little simple and clear about that, your editors are not. Okay? They really don't know much anyway about anything. But on agriculture, when we talk of agriculture, we're talking about the agriculturists. We're talking about farmers, farm laborers, etc., that sort of thing. Agrarian society is much larger than the agriculturist society. It includes all those allied occupations, okay? Handlooms, handicrafts, tailors, julahas, weavers, all these together with your agriculturists make up that larger society we call agrarian society. By the way, in the Indian census, fishermen and forest workers forestry also come under agriculture. Okay, so agrarian is something much larger. I also want to say this, and I've been saying this for 5 years. What we call an agrarian crisis has gone way beyond the agrarian as well. It is, for some years now, it's been a societal crisis. And I'm not sure we shouldn't be referring to it as a civilizational crisis, as the largest body of smallholders in the world who own their land. The largest body of such smallholders in the world fight for their very survival. Okay. Yeah. Second, when I said those allied occupations are in trouble, they have received no attention even. It's not infotech or any other such exotic thing that is the big employer after agriculture. The second biggest employer in your country after agriculture is handlooms and handicrafts. They are your second biggest employer. millions and millions of human beings. From the 80s onwards, they started developing and increasingly became dependent on urban markets. And what happens with the pandemic? These groups of people, of these occupations, make the maximum amount of their money between, say, November and March, when all the festivals, Delhi Heart, the BKC exhibitions in Mumbai, the Bandra Reclamation exhibitions, the ones in Kolkata, all these take place and the maximum number of orders, work, sales happen here. When the lockdown happened, with 4 hours of notice given to a nation of 1.3 billion, they were smashed. Many of the festival handloom handicrafts exhibitions were cancelled. Many were stuck in the cities with those exhibitions going on. Gigantic stockpiles of inventory back in the villages and towns where they came from. Starvation, weavers of Chirala, toy makers of Varanasi were on the brink of starvation. Okay. They were, the allied occupations have always been dependent on how agriculture is doing. That's why they're called agrarian. They're not cultivators themselves, but they're dependent on how agriculture does. Not many people know that even before the farm suicides, the first large numbers of suicides in the country in 91, 92 were of weavers. Because when farmers went bankrupt, the weavers lost their first market. But anyway, so livelihoods, all of them. What did COVID-19 do for you? It did something. COVID-19 has given us a brilliant, searing autopsy of the society we are and of what neoliberalism means. The corpse is on the table. Every nerve, sinew, muscle, organ, vein, artery are on ugly, visible display. They were there earlier, but this time it's very difficult to turn your head away. We still manage that, but there are those who manage that, but it's very difficult to turn away. COVID-19 has done an autopsy of your society, showing you who we are, what we are. Yeah. It was there earlier also. As I said, we didn't really get into a tizzy nationally over the fact that 330,000 farmers had committed suicide in distress, most of them in distress. Now, where does this agrarian crisis go back to? From 1991, we adopted a raft of policies. Yeah, primarily, they were about opening up sector after sector for the corporate world. In agriculture, we unleashed market-based pricing, which simply meant price gouging. Yeah, Monsanto's seeds, BT cotton seeds, were selling in 2003 at about 1650 to 1800 rupees for 450 grams packet. Yeah. When a new government came to power in Andhra Pradesh and dragged them before the Monopolies Restrictive Trade Practices Commission, when such an institution actually still meant something, they dropped their price from that 16 to 1800 band to 925 rupees and then to 750 rupees overnight. Overnight. Imagine what was the royalty on each bag of seeds. So in this market, unleashing of market-based pricing, farmers were price gouged by corporations. Seeds, pesticides, all the inputs today of agriculture are in the hands of corporations. Large corporations. 3 seed companies account for, something like 40–50%, maybe more of all seed, profit-making seed sold in the world, in particular crops like cotton, for instance. So that process created, and then we sidelined, we took away credit from the farmer, diverted it towards the corporate sector. And as the farmers predictably went into a gigantic debt crisis, we started saying, hey, you know, the media were there to say, don't waive these debts. It's a moral hazard. I hope you know that if you just get on to the websites of the All India Bank Employees Associations and Unions, you will see that 7.5 lakh crores of your 8 lakh, 9 lakh crore NPAs are not from farmers, they are from big business and corporate houses. Yeah, from your Malias, Choksis, the whole gang. Millions of farmers account for less than what a handful of businessmen and relatively speaking, a handful of businessmen and corporations account for. That is one set of things. So the credit crisis came up, and at the very time, input costs exploded because corporations were able to set any price they wanted on seed, fertilizer, whatever. They were able to do that at the very time that you subjected the farmer to this price gouging. You took away the credit from her and him. You withdrew the credit. Let me give you an example from our time, right now, this era, last 5 years. All of you, anyone sitting in Punjab knows NABARD, okay, your National Bank for Agricultural, Rural Development, etc. I'm sitting in Mumbai. Maharashtra is a 55% population rural state. I'm sitting in the most urban part, perhaps, of India, Mumbai. NABARD every year comes out with a potential linked credit plan, PLCP, which will tell you what the flows of agricultural credit will be. From 2017, you can see, in the 2017 report, you can see very clearly, 53% of all agricultural credit in Maharashtra goes to Mumbai. Where are the agriculturists in Mumbai? Where are all those poor, struggling homesteads of farmers in Mumbai? Where are those little farmers? Yeah. Well, I know two. One is called Mukesh and the other is called Anil, and a third for the last few years called Baba, hanging around Vidarbha. The fact is, there are no agriculturists of any significance in Mumbai, but there is a very significant agri-business. And that's where the credit is going. And NABARD does not make a secret of this. It defends this. It says this is the correct way to go. We have to give them incentives. So much of the credit is cornered by non-farmers. And then you say, hey, why are these guys getting into debt? Because they're taking money, whatever money they can at any prices. They're taking non-agricultural loans from banks, which have much higher rates of interest, and they're getting into very deep trouble. Okay? So all these factors from that time onwards are also reflected in the farming population and in the new crisis that you saw in your pandemic. One, oh, by the way, input costs, when I say they went up, I mean by 300 to 500% in major crops, more than 500% in some crops. In 1990s, even late 1990s, an acre of irrigated cotton in Vidarbha, center of cotton, cost about 10 to 12,000 rupees an acre cultivation cost. An acre of unirrigated cotton, it cost about 2,500 to 4,000 rupees to cultivate. 10 years, I took this measurement in 2003. 10 years later, in 2013, an acre of unirrigated cotton cost 15 to 18,000 rupees to cultivate. Irrigated cotton, 45,000 rupees and upwards. So the costs of cultivation exploded, but not the income of the farmers. Now, Mr. Modi is telling you that he is going to double the farmers' income by 2022, and that he guarantees MSP, and that everybody is a bunch of liars, including his old friends in the Akalis who have resigned and stepped out of his cabinet and the NDA. I have a solution to offer. I've been putting it out everywhere. Mr. Modi agreed that transactions should not be below MSP. He was the chairman in 2011 of the National Working Group on Consumer Affairs when he was the Chief Minister of Gujarat. Okay, he was the Chief Minister of Gujarat. You have a photograph of him, you can Google it, submitting the report to Dr. Manmohan Singh and Pranab Das standing by in the background, cheering, or as much as Pranab Das could cheer. And recommendation B3 of that report of Mr. Narendra Modi, CM, says no transaction should be allowed between trader and farmer at below the MSP price. Why did you simply not put that into your laws? So I suggested one more bill. You've put 3 bills through Parliament, you've smashed them, bulldozed them, thrown out MPs from Parliament. I offer you a simple suggestion, 5-paragraph bill, 4 elements. Every single member of Parliament would vote for it, and it's all based on your assurances. 1, MSP is guaranteed as per the Swaminathan formula, which is what the BJP promised in its campaign in 2014. 2, no transaction at below MSP price between traders, big business corporations on the one hand, and farmers on the other, which is what Mr. Modi promised, recommended strongly to the government in 2011. 3rd, guaranteed procurement. We can discuss later why, because otherwise governments will make a mockery. They will announce high MSPs and they will not buy. They will not procure. They will not pick up. And 4th element, you want to double farmers' incomes by 2022. Cancellation of farmer debt. You can't double anyone's income either by 2022, or which is 20 months away, or by 2042 if those you're trying to rescue are drowning in debt. If they are dying in debt, how the hell are you going to double their income? So you put these 4 elements down. You were promising the waivers before you came to power. Then you discovered it's a moral hazard. Why don't you just put your 4 assurances, 4 paragraphs, 5th paragraph conclusion? Those MPs you threw out of Parliament will come back walking on their hands to vote for you. Anyway, that's the agrarian part of it. It's all part of these structural inequalities. We birthed a new generation of inequalities in 1991. And the nature of the inequalities we brought in with what were then cutely called the new economic reforms was that we brought in a wave of new inequalities while entrenching the existing ones of caste, class, gender. Here's a simple thing for you since then. In 1991, this country did not have a single dollar billionaire, not one. 2008, we had, even as late as 2008, we had some 12, 14 of them. 2013, we had 53 dollar billionaires. 2018, we had 121 dollar billionaires on the Forbes list, accounting for the equivalent wealth of 22% of your gross domestic product, giving that whole other meaning to the word gross. Okay? 22% of the GDP is the value of wealth of 121 individuals in a population of 1.3 billion. What about farmers' incomes in that time? The last data we have is the NSS of 2013. As you know, this government has killed data, withheld NSS data. In fact, the NDA has come to be known as no data available. That's who this formation is. But the last data we have on farm household incomes, not individual, and the household would have about 4 or 5 people. The last data we have, the average income of an Indian farm household of about 5 people, monthly average, including income from agriculture and all other sources, 6,426 rupees. 6,426 rupees. That's a per capita of under 1,300 if you take 5 members families. You compare that with the rise in billionaires. You compare the fact of the socio-economic caste census of 2012, which said 75% of rural households, the main breadwinner, takes home less than 5,000 rupees. You raise the benchmark, you raise the bar to 10,000, yeah, it becomes 90% of rural households have the main breadwinner earns less than 10,000 a month, takes home less than 10,000 a month. Total number of people, rural households where the main breadwinner takes home 10,000 or more, 8%. Now you apply your caste filters to that, your gender filters to that. Adivasis and Dalits, it falls to half of that 8%. Women households don't even ask. I mean, women-led households don't even ask. Don't even ask. They're way below the BPL, below the poverty line. So you have, on the one hand, 22% of your gross domestic product, the equivalent wealth of that sitting in the hands of 121 individuals, and you have your farmers here subjected to gigantic price rises, subjected to incredible input cost increases, exploding input costs, yeah, and crash, hugely manipulated crash in price. Now we are saying, hey, that's actually a good thing. Farmers then have a choice. They don't have to go to the APMC. At this moment, farmers are sitting in Maharashtra with 30 lakh quintals of unsold cotton from the Rabi crop. They're sitting with tens of lakhs of quintals of sugarcane unsold from the Rabi crop. And thanks to the state governments and corporations encouraging them, they have repeated those crops in the Kharif season. So you know what's going to happen at the end of the Kharif season? Even the very poor prices for cotton and sugarcane just now are going to collapse further. Yeah. Welcome to neoliberal capitalism. This is what is going to happen. It is what is intended to happen. Please know that. It's not an accident. I've seen it now for, I don't know, 20 years, how the APMCs, the procurement centers, and all of them work. Now, this also meant from 91, as we put pressure on the farming community, there's a collapse in the farm population of full-time farmers. Now, I need you to follow me very closely on this point because of all the damn stereotypes that the media imbibe and pass on to the middle class audience. You know, here we have, I mean, there we have a couple of learned economists, leading economists from Colombia, dons of Colombia, right? The dons of Colombia, Panagaria and Jagdish Bhagwati, writing in their book that 53% of Indians are farmers. No, they're not. Less than 8% of Indians are farmers. 53% of the population is dependent on agriculture. That's not the same thing at all. The main cultivator in the census, his population is falling. But these are experts, right? You know, but Don Bhagwati and Sancho Panagaria can say anything, and the media will simply lap it up because it's what the media want to hear. Now, in the actual figures of the census, yeah, what are these actual figures? Between the 1991 census and the 2011 census, the population of full-time farmers, those who work on farming, cultivating a plot of land for at least 180 days in the year, that has fallen by 15 million in 20 years. Between 91 and 2001 census, it fell by 7.2 million. 2001 to 2011 census, it fell by 7.7 million. I have no idea, nobody does, what would have been the fall between 2011 and 2020. We hopefully will have a decent census in 21. But here's the thing. The maximum outflow of people abandoning or quitting agriculture happened between 2001 and 2011. And these were your migrant laborers who came to the towns, cities, big towns, small cities, big towns, big cities, in search of jobs that were never there. There were no such jobs. So they became your domestic servant and mine, right? And when the pandemic broke, millions of them, I mean millions of them, the government again tells you it has no data. That's very politely and charitably. Yeah. Just the Shramik trains alone, according to the railways, carried more than 1 crore workers. 91 lakhs of them just between May 1 and May 26. Imagine how many more since then. And imagine how many millions walked their way to the villages between March 25th and May 1. So, and here was the media asking this anguished question, trying to do positive stories on middle-class compassion. You know? Asking the question, why are they leaving? You know, I mean, we are such lovely people. Who would ever want to stop working for us as our serfs? Why are they leaving? And the other question, I got I don't know how many thousands of emails. Will they come back? Both were wrong questions. The question was not, why are they leaving? The question is, why did they abandon agriculture and come here in the first place? Why? What was that? That was your agrarian crisis. That was the big push factor, pushing tens of millions of people off agriculture. Will they come back? Wrong question. Of course, many of them will come back. It'll be a very disrupted process. Many of them will come back, and they'll come back at worse conditions than before, because we have passed a bunch of 3 labor codes as well, in addition to the farm laws, which really, really make workers defenseless, increasingly defenseless, and will affect, those 3 labor bills will affect 74% of industrial workers and 70% of all organized industries. So we're in fact bringing the conditions of the informal workers to the organized workers as well. So these were the things that were happening. And what about the media? Now, the media, I think all of you have heard of the chronology of this government on the farm crisis and the media are what I'm going to end on. I just want to tell you that there's no way that the media can ever tell you the truth about the markets, because they're too heavily involved in the markets to be able to tell you that truth. All of you have heard of the debates over the Swaminathan Commission, and by the way, it was actually the National Commission of Farmers, chaired by the illustrious Dr. Swaminathan, and the BJP and the Mr. Modi came to power in 2014 on the promise of implementing the Swaminathan Commission's recommendation, one of the many recommendations, of the farmer's price, MSP, minimum support price, should be equal to C2 plus 50%. Comprehensive cost of production plus 50%. There are many different ways of dallying with this word cost of production. Mainly 3. One was A2, which was simply, strictly paid out costs on inputs. Second was A2 plus FL, family labor, which is input cost plus imputed cost of family labor. The third was Swaminathan's, comprehensive cost of production. The difference between A2 plus FL and C2 can be 400 to 500 rupees on a quintal of wheat or paddy. Anyway, the government promised 2014, we will implement this recommendation of Swaminathan. 2015, we will do it in 12 months. 2015, they submitted an affidavit in the Supreme Court. We can't do it. It's not feasible. It's not desirable. It will distort market prices. 2016, the then Agriculture Minister Radha Mohan Singh declared, I never made such a promise. We never made such a promise. 2017, the BJP said, forget Swaminathan, look at Madhya Pradesh. Shivraj Singh Chauhan ji's model goes way beyond Swaminathan. And that was about the time you heard about the shooting of 5 farmers in Mandsaur in Madhya Pradesh. 2018 and 19, Mr. Arun Jaitley, please, I'll save you the time. You can look at the exact paragraphs in the budget speech. Paragraph 13 and paragraph 14. He says, we have already implemented Swaminathan in the Rabi crop and we are preparing for the Kharif. The sleight of hand was that you were saying, was in the word cost of production. They were using the A2 plus FL category, which is 400 to 500 rupees lower per quintal price than the Swaminathan comprehensive cost of production plus 50%. Now the media went with this at all times unquestioning because the media are corporate owned. Okay. In the 80s, you know, people still tell me about, what do you think of this rat race in the media for TRPs? And oh man, the rat race in the media was over a long time ago. The rats won. From the early 80s, you have a process of corporatization. I am extremely proud of belonging to the profession of Indian journalist and reporter. Yeah, a few days, barely just on 28th, yeah, we celebrated someone, even in Punjab, it offends me that you look at him as a martyr, a revolutionary, an activist, all of which is true and correct. But we don't recognize that Bhagat Singh was a professional journalist. And what are journalists? Writes in 4 languages, learns 2 others while he's in prison, writes in 4 languages, publishing in Punjabi, in Urdu, in Hindi, in English. Borrows 312 books while in prison to make notes for his jail diaries. This is the sort of journalist he was. Yeah. Anyway, the media now, from a very proud legacy, media from the 80s are entirely on a path of corporatization. The richest Indian in the world, the 4th richest man in the world, and the richest Indian, Mukesh Bhai, is the biggest owner of media. Okay, that's one set of things. Second, the media have increasingly moved from the big tangential properties they once owned in real estate. They've steadily moved in the brave new neoliberal world era towards notional wealth in terms of shares, stocks, debentures, whatever else you want to call it. So when the 2008 Wall Street collapse took place, when the Wall Street collapse took place in 2008, the media, please go back and look at the Times of India, look at its colleagues in other brands. They're telling you there's no recession in India. We're doing quite well. And while saying this, they were sacking hundreds of journalists. Over 2,000 journalists lost their jobs between just between October 2008 and October 2009 assembly elections in Maharashtra. And 2,000 lost their jobs nationally. Now, at a time when the public need this media more than ever, at the time when the public needs journalists and journalism the most, the biggest and the richest media houses have sacked 1,200 journalists. And heaven knows how many non-journalist media workers. How are you going to, even what little chance they had of covering the pandemic and telling the people what was, giving them journalism that was useful to people, that chance is snuffed out because they've thrown out 1,200 journalists from an already shrinking working force. Let me tell you that even before the pandemic, what are the figures of rural India agriculture in the Indian media? The so-called national dailies, I just love that word. It means any newspaper that has at least one edition, possibly just one edition, coming out of New Delhi. That's a national day. The rest of us are anti-national, of course, we've always been. So the national dailies, the front page of your average national daily, on average, 5-year average, gives 0.67% of its front page space to rural India, where 69% of the population live. Okay. Second, if you go on the inside pages, agriculture, environment, health, all the social sectors put together get less space than crime and entertainment. And as you know, in India, there's a gigantic overlap between crime and entertainment. Look at what's going on in the Narcotics Bureau. Are you covering that because it's crime, or are you covering that because it's a bunch of unfortunate, Bollywood actresses being dragged out into the public eye on absolutely stupid, brainless grounds, right? So this is who you are as a media. We are that as a media because from the 80s, from the late 70s, the legacy of the freedom struggle in the media dies. A few months from now, 2022, the Prime Minister's dateline for the farmers' income, from 2020, that will be 200 years of the Indian media as I recognize it. Not Hickey's Gazette and some idiotic tabloid from Britain, but Raja Ram Mohan Roy's Miratul Akhbar, which by the way was a newspaper in Persian, not Bengali. Sorry for my apologies to my Bengali friends, but it was a newspaper from that date, for the next 170 years, the finest of Indian journalism, the Gandhis, the Bhagat Singhs, the Ambedkars. Look at the kind of issues they took. Look at who they were. You know what they were? They were independent journalists. They were not dependent on advertising. They were not dependent on, they were certainly not dependent on the corporate world in the sense that they are today. Today, the media are no longer pro-corporate, which they were in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Today, the media are big business. They are gigantic conglomerates. They are gigantic corporates. When the Brave New World came, newspapers, which had gigantic physical properties, were shifting their properties to wealth in shares. The Times of India, through private treaties and other things, started acquiring shares in hundreds of other companies. Okay. Now, when the Wall Street collapse struck and the tremors went all over the world, many of the shares held by Indian newspapers weren't worth the paper they were published on. They were printed on. So you had that collapse. And that's when paid news becomes an industry. 2009, I will brag a little here and say I broke that story on the front page of the Hindu with Mr. Ashok Chavan's election accounts. So you have paid news taking over. It is no longer individual corruption of a journalist or an editor. It is an industry. And that one that its cases are still pending in the Supreme Court. So you have the transformation of corporate ownership. It reduces the proud legacy of Indian journalism to a revenue stream. Journalism as a revenue stream. Journalism was never meant to be a revenue stream. You know, Mr. Samir Jain once said, and I've said it he said it many times, journalism is like any other business. I don't agree. You know, you can't sell today's newspaper tomorrow, right? How can you? You can sell today's toothpaste for another few weeks, but you can't sell today's news. News is different. Information is different. So, you know, I agree that the media are a business, and I make a strong distinction between media and journalism. Television channels are a business. Newspaper houses are a business. Corporate media houses are a business. Journalism is a calling, never a business. Show me one great journalist in history who saw this profession as a business. Gandhi, Ambedkar, Bhagat Singh. which they saw it as a way of connecting with their society, of linking up, of trying to represent the voiceless, right? And there was always this organic connection between the illiterate masses of the population and the individual journalist. When Tilak was sentenced to 6 years imprisonment for sedition, he was 22 people died on the streets from police firing. Those were textile workers of Mumbai who couldn't read, but said his freedom of expression defends ours, right? So in conclusion, you're looking at a media. Please don't think your media are different from other sectors of the corporate world. Well, they are, in the sense that their product is different and they are much more canny, much more cunning. They have more weapons of, bludgeoning someone into doing something, but they are also incredibly beholden to government and the state for three very simple reasons. One, if you look at it, the media, the Indian billionaires who mostly own the media, most of the media, what I call the dominant sections of the media, your average Indian billionaire is a man who makes a rentier income, meaning he gets public resources, oil and natural gas, and then subcontracts, etc., makes his money without doing a stitch of work. Okay? And for that needs incredible connections with government and bureaucracy and administration and all of that, and with the establishment. The more you get into that, the less you can do with, the less you can confront establishment, the less you can tell truth. Second, the media, where newspapers used to be one man, one family acts, they are now part of gigantic conglomerates, huge conglomerates, which there are so many interests. I started listing them and I came about 200 in a day without much problem. Major media channels are into, media organizations are into aviation, agriculture, mining, fisheries, usury, everything else. The third is what I can call the non-technological convergence, a very South Asian phenomenon, but happening elsewhere in the world. Gigantic media houses move into politics. They buy into politics and politicians. Gigantic political forces buy into the media big time. Punjab, Andhra Pradesh, my home state, all great examples. And big business and corporate owners move into both politics and media. So you have really what Ben Begdickian in Media Monopoly called corporate incest within corporate incest. The interlocking of these interests is too deep for these guys to ever be able. They have a structural compulsion to lie. But is there then hope for your farmers? And yes. And for your agrarian, the protests you are seeing today are part of a chapter that began in this book of distress in 2018, when 40,000 of the poorest farmers marched in 40 degrees heat, 182 kilometers over hills and valley and everything else from Nashik to Mumbai, and really shook the world. It's from then that farmers start fighting back in a new phase. As I said, that's a new chapter, old book. And then farmers from 21 states, 5 union territories, inspired by them, assembled in Delhi at Parliament in a march on Parliament in November 29, 2018. This has been growing. Farmer unrest has been growing. And what's interesting is from 2018, sections of the middle classes start joining them, like they did in Mumbai for the first time that I saw in 36 years in this city. Yeah. So there's hope, but are things going to get better? Yep. But things will get a lot worse before they get better. Thank you.
Thank you, Sainath, for that really magnificent canvas that you have covered with pain and anger and there's sadness and hopelessness, and yet a note of hope. And before I open it up to people, because I know there are many people who are going to ask questions, and I have a list of them, and I will recognize two of them first because I got to know that they had questions beforehand. I would like to say two things about, not just your talk, but in the points because I've been taking notes all along. I have enough for a chapter of a new book. So, but it's been a huge learning. And until you pointed it out, this fabric, the fabric that is woven of the rural world, the rural universe, did not come alive. You're always seeing handicrafts as one side, handlooms as another, but they're all part of a family. It's the rural family that is in distress. And, I just take up your point about whether it's the national dailies or the anti-national dailies or media. Dhiren Bezbarua, whom you may have met many years ago, who was the founder editor of the Sentinel in Assam, he said one thing to me: there is no mass media. There is only a metro media. There is no national media. There's only a metro media. And I always think of that as so compellingly correct. And the manipulation that is going on is extraordinary, and the way people are out of jobs and so on. How much in bed the corporate and the media are with government is very visible. I'll make one other point, and then I'm going to open it up to questions and comments. As I said, we have quite a few, and people have listened very attentively to you and with great, I think, sense of solidarity. I think the other thing that I wanted to just reflect upon very briefly, and perhaps in your comments you would talk about it, is the deaths which were occurring before, it became known as the farmers' deaths from the 1990s when we started covering all this. And the fact is that debt and disaster, how can the economy even survive this? I mean, it's already been several months of this pandemic, which has shrunk our economy, and shrunk the stomachs and the minds of people. And I will end with this one point. You talked about the labor statistics, the fact that the Labor Department, the Labor Commissioner at one point said, we have no statistics. We went and filed an RTI saying that, because I got a letter from the Labor Commission saying that we are gathering data on migrants and migrant camps. And then within 2 weeks of that, they said we have no data. So we filed an RTI, they stonewalled, and then we filed another RTI, and the commission actually wrapped the Labor Commission over the knuckles and said that within a week, provide everything that you have, whether it's complete or not. And they did. So there are systems still we can use to advocate, to push. I'm going to now just close my initial remarks, and because this is really about human rights.
So, Sanjoy,
everything that you
could you put up 3 questions at a time? I'll take 3 at a time.
Well, I don't know what the first 2 questions are, because I know the people who are going to ask them.
Okay.
So I'm going to call on Sumail Singh Sidhu and Ahmed Faraz Khan to ask their questions briefly, because they're not in the chat. So those are the 2 questions we'll start with.
Okay.
And then we'll open it up to Sarabjot and Guru Pradesh and others. So could we start with Mr. Sidhu and Mr. Khan.
Sanjay, just a moment. I'm trying to get Sidhu Saab online. I think probably he is Sumail Singh Sidhu ji. I think yes, we have. So I have already unmuted him. And the other one which you're looking for? Sanjoy.
The other one is Ahmed Faraz Khan. He is a senior reporter from the Dawn, Pakistan.
All right.
Covers agriculture there.
I've already unmuted Sidhu Saab.
Yeah. Thanks, Sanjoy and Preeti. And thanks, P Sainath, for another enlightening talk on the questions that we have grown with reading your works and books and listening to you for a long period of time. One is this. I am actually intrigued by your usage of the term civilizational crisis, which is from a crisis of agriculture to agrarian, and along with the allied occupation that you have termed it an civilizational crisis. Is it only in terms of the allied occupations that we are calling it a civilizational one, or does it carry a much more loaded understanding of a civilizational thing? Because you see, this relates to Punjab in the sense that the medieval Punjab, in which Guru Nanak actually tilled the land for 25 years, and dignity of labor was a shared concern across Nirgun Bhakts and the Sikh Gurus. We find Kabir, a weaver, Ravidas, a leather worker, Namdev working with clothes, and Tanna Bhagat, and so on. So this is one thing. And then agrarian revolts, there is a whole Banda Bahadur success. And then, of course, it also had modern Indian languages were enshrined in it, the literature and the conceptual paradigm that they came out with. In that sense, there was a forging of a greater civilizational coherence around this question of labor, and that also in those very sectors that you mentioned. So when we are talking about a civilizational crisis, it means that this whole thing, not just these occupations, but the things related to these ideological questions, these regional identities, and the backbone that is provided by these laboring traditions to the various religious and sectarian other things also is kind of going to be eclipsed.
I'm going to ask you to stop right there because we have a lot of questions. So can I just request
Sanjoy, I'm just coming to the point.
Sorry, as the moderator, I'm going to stop you here. And we will go to the next question. If you wish to ask more questions,
I was just getting at that. Please, I just,
No, you've taken a fair amount of time. So I think the question is clear. Mr. Sainath will respond. And Mr. Khan, I'm giving you the floor if you are there.
Well, I have already unmuted, but I think probably he's already left. And then we have Kishore Thukral. And then Kamlesh Mohan from...
No, you'll have to just give me a chance to, prioritize who I'm going to ask the questions to. So if you could mute yourself and let me handle this. There is a question from Sarabjot Behel with required reference to the acquired understanding of the agricultural ecosystem. Is it safe to assume that a proactive cooperative system for big and small landholders can be a viable alternative to beat back the corporate takeover in the wake of these new wills? And he also says, if 50% are dependent on agriculture and it's not profitable, according to you, can they, there's somebody else, I think, choose other work, including skill development, etc.? So I'm putting those two questions to you. One is from Sarabjot Behel and the other is from a different person.
Okay. The first of the questions was, why I term it a possible civilizational crisis. Well, for 2-3 reasons. And by the way, I agree with some of the things the gentleman said in terms of the historic earlier cohesion of these different sections. That's absolutely correct. There was a tighter civilization of fabric. But first, I said that This is the largest body of smallholders in the world. The Chinese peasant doesn't own her land or his land. These are the largest body of smallholders, small landowners in the world. Yeah? In a civilization based on farming, on family farming, community farming, group farming, like the community farming of the Adivasis, for instance. So in that sense, when their survival and their livelihoods are threatened and smashed, it is a civilizational crisis. There's a second reason why I call it that. And my reason is this. At some point a few years ago, as many of you know already, that I'm that unfortunate mug who went out and suicide, visited 900 households where there have been farmers' suicides. Believe me, you visit 3 such households, see what it does to you. Okay? At the end of 900, I had to ask myself, is this any more, apart and the fact that it was spreading, there I don't agree. I'm not saying it because of the allied livelihoods or anything. I'm looking at it from the point of view of who we are and what our attitudes have been. There's a point where it was no longer just about how much production has fallen. It was not even about how many lives have been lost, because, by the way, for every farmer who committed suicide, there's hundreds of thousands who didn't commit suicide, but who are in a very similar anguish and situation, right? So for me, the point was, it's no longer just about how much production has been lost, how many lives have been lost, but about how much of our humanity have we lost. What sort of people are we? What sort of human beings are we that we could sit by? We have taken it, okay? I mean, it's okay with us that 330,000 people from one occupation take their lives. It breaks. In 1978, in 77, 78, as a student of JNU and of the great Romila Thapar, I read the Annals of Rome, by Tacitus, the Roman historian. And something that he said bothered me enormously. He hated Nero, but was objective and factual enough to say Nero did not start the fire that destroyed Rome. And he held a gigantic party. To take people's minds off the fire, at which the finest of the Roman world was assembled. The greatest scientists, philosophers, thinkers, musicians, centurions, generals, all of them were there. The creme de la creme of the Roman world was there in that party. And one of the things that they did at the party, they had a problem of illumination. And in the words of Tacitus, they brought forth wretched prisoners from the dungeons, impaled them on sticks and tied them to wooden rods and logs, and set them on fire, thereby to provide the nightly illumination for the party. Ever since then, it bothered me not who Nero was. Nero was a small timer compared to the sadists of the 20th century and the 21st. But one thing bothered me always after that. Who were Nero's guests? There is no record that any one of these great human beings stood up and protested at what was being done. Who were Nero's guests? What kind of mentality did it require in these super elite to be able to quaff another goblet of wine or pop another fig in your mouth while another human being burst into flames? When I started covering the farm suicides, I got the answer to my question. You know, I understood who Nero's guests were. It took me 20 odd years, but it happened. I understood that we were Nero's guests. Yeah. So that's why I say it's a civilizational crisis. Now, where has been our moral outrage? Where has been our protest? The second of those questions, whether the co-ops and alternatives and options exist, of course they do. And there are, and maybe, you know, maybe it will not be called a co-op. Maybe it will be called something else. In Maharashtra, we had an era where the co-ops were cooperatives were extremely progressive. And in the regions where they were strong, like Western Maharashtra, those developed much better than their neighboring regions. Later, these cooperatives politically were taken over into cooperatives. You can have 15,000 members and two families, rivals, controlling the co-op. But in your own country, there are very fine models. How many people have even heard, how many editors know anything about the Kudumbashree movement in Kerala? 4.3 million members, all women. 4.3 million women in thousands of livelihoods. They have built a solidarity economy. They began around 1998. I remember being at one of their earliest, if not the founding launch, where they had 10,000 members. Today they have 4.3 million members, including a quarter or 350,000 women farmers, landless farmers, who have taken on lease little plots and run them on a collective basis on a, what they call Sangha Krishi. In Kerala, Sangha Krishi means group farming, because some people are a little, you know, iffy about using the word collective farming. I use the word collective farming. The largest of their collectives is 1 hectare and 10 women. The smallest of their collectives is 1 acre and 4 women. Do you know how many there are now? 70,000. These are the only small farmers I saw making systematic profits for 18 out of 20 years. They've been smashed in the last 2 years because of another civilizational problem, threatening problem, called climate change. The incredible floods and rains, and this, I'm sorry to say, that the progressives in the farming and agriculture movement are not taking seriously. We take it very seriously in the People's Archive of Rural India. We have a whole section, a small universe on climate change reporting and agriculture. So the women of Kudumbashree, what did they do differently from the co-ops? What did they do differently from everybody else that made them successful? In 2018, after the floods, I went and met a group of 5 women running 1 acre on which they grew organic bananas, which have a premium price at Onam time in Kerala. Would you believe that each of these women made net profit of 50,000 rupees from 1 acre? 5 women, 1 acre. Yeah, and no great technological whatever. They did. Because they ran on a principle. And I'm saying that all our struggles, whether in the media, whether in education, whether in agriculture, are going to be fought, are going to be rewarding if we fight them on the principle they adopted. 2 things they did. 1, when I asked them, are you an NGO? I thought I'd get beaten up. I said self-help group, they got pretty pissed off. They said very correctly, this word self-help is a very selfish, it's a very selfish concept. And it goes back to mid-Victorian times, the essays of Samuel Smiles. You know, his point was, people are poor because the workers are all alcoholics. Yeah, they got to pull themselves up by the bootstrap and, you know, work harder. And that was the famous essay of Mr. Samuel Smiles, self-help. They said, A, we are a solidarity economy. We are there for each other. We call ourselves CDS, community development groups, not self-help groups. We are there for each other. We don't abandon you to look after yourself. We are neighborhood groups. And third, we work on the principle of justice. They had a concept of food justice that was fascinating to me. And I think now we must adopt that in every other sphere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah.
There are a couple of others who wish to come in. One is, I think Faraz is waiting.
Yeah.
So could the person kindly unmute Mr. Faraz, and then we have a couple of other questions we will take.
Yeah. Let's take all three.
Okay, so Faraz is there, after which we have Japnam Singh, because Mr. Singh says that what should be the long-term goals of protesters who will protest against the center, not just on the MSPs, but the recent acts. There is Mr. Sukhdev Singh who asks about codified labor laws because of the backdrop of compromised labor class with establishments having 300 or more workers who only needed to require, only these need to seek permission for hiring and firing.
Yeah.
So if you could go with Mr. Faraz and then Japnam Singh and then Mr. Sukhdev Singh.
Yeah, Sanjay, I couldn't see Faraz. I have already unmuted Japnam Singh.
Yes, good evening, sir.
Just a moment.
Yes.
Is Faraz online?
No, Faraz, I couldn't find him.
Okay. Okay, Mr. Japnam Singh, please, you have the floor.
Yes, good evening, sir. Yes, I wanted to ask what should be the long-term goals of these protests? Because there are many issues apart from MSP and these ordinances only. So
Okay.
there are, there is Swaminathan report, the Farmer Commission's report, and other issues which are the common demands of people or farmers in India.
Right. Thank you.
Especially in Punjab. Yes.
We've actually read your question out. And
Yes,
so, Sainath, if you could respond to him and Mr. Sukhdev Singh's question, which I've also read.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I think you're entirely right to be worried about the long-term, for me, even the short-term future of protest. Okay. I personally think that things are pretty bad, but they're going to get a lot worse. Yeah. I think a model was developed in the last few years. And though it is absolutely wrong to pretend that all this starts with Mr. Modi. That's not true.
Yes,
The criminalization of dissent has been going on for decades. Yeah. When in 2016, I addressed the students of my old alma mater, JNU, I went there in sympathy with them, and we had a sit out, teach in class. And my first words to them, and I love them, mind you, my first words to them were, welcome to the rest of India. Where how many movements of people against corporations, against land seizure, against POSCO, against Vedanta, simply catch people and put them, one individual, under 50, 60 cases. Abhay Sahu, the man who led the agitation against POSCO. Yeah. When I meet Abhay Sahu, I ask, my first question is, Abhay, how many? And then he gives me the latest score. He's made it up to 56. You try destroying people by putting them under these false cases. I believe that we have to fight for a law that penalizes false arrest. It's there in major democracies of the world. Wrongful arrest has consequences. Today, just look at what those policemen did in Hathras, disposing of that, I don't know, 20-year-old. She's a 20-year-old girl. Okay, she's just a girl.
Yes.
Yeah. Look at what they did. You're going to have, okay, that's one thing. You're going to need a law against false arrest, wrongful arrest. The second thing, about protest, I'm very impressed with what the farmers have shown us. Okay? Despite the circumstances, pandemic, lockdown, police repression, they're still out there. Do you know one of Gandhi's famous quotes? He said, when the farmers realize the power of their non-violent strength, when the farmers realize the potential of their non-violent strength, no power on earth can keep them down. No power on earth can keep them down. Remember, this was a man who really becomes a Mahatma with his visit to the Champaran farmers. I mean, that's when I really think he takes off. Okay. So I think that there is going to be huge repression. And I think a model began a few years ago. It began with Bhima Koregaon, okay, where a protest takes place in Maharashtra. People are arrested in Delhi. People who have had nothing to do with it at all are just thrown into prison, they're sitting there at high risk of COVID. One or two of them have already suffered COVID. Yeah. And it is not at all a especially important case for the courts, though Riya Chakraborty and Sushant Singh Rajput are very important, urgent cases to be taken up first thing in the morning on a given day that they are brought before the court. So that model is then expanded, elaborated, finessed beyond insanity in the way they've treated the way they've approached the Delhi riots cases. Okay? It's just fantastic. Your idea is to throw as much mud at anyone, and the object of it is very simple. They are terrifying the middle classes. Don't mess with us. You want to go and get involved in activism, this will be the price you pay. So people are I don't know how many in those 3,000 pages, people whose reputations they have ruined, people for whom that name will always stick. The third, you can see the application of the model, is in the Sushant Singh Rajput Riya Chakraborty case, right? Where, and there I want to make a little point about the media. You see, the thing is, a lot of people wrote to me saying, isn't it shocking? Isn't it? It's surprising that farmers' suicides don't get this attention, but Sushant Singh's suicide gets this attention. I replied that it was not surprising in the least. It is shocking, but not surprising, because Talk TV is a very sound revenue model. Reporting is an expensive business relatively. If you got to send a reporter out, cover something, spend weeks wherever they spend it, come back, that costs money. Having 5 clowns on a panel shout at each other, it costs very little. And Talk TV, that's why Talk TV is a very lucrative model. The third model of intimidation. It's not happening because, in my opinion, it's not just because of the Bihar elections. It's happening, an entire fraternity called Bollywood is being told, and a fraternity that was largely quiescent with this establishment is being told that even minor squeaks of dissent are not to be tolerated. So I think this is the future for protesters. You have to know what you're getting into. You have to know that this is going to happen. And you've got to stand up to it, and you've got to face up to it. Yeah. But one of the things we can do, I think the farmers are showing us the way, and we're going to have to accept this idea of being criminalized for protesting.
Thank you. Thank you for those very, very succinct points on focusing on arbitrariness, impunity, and the nature of the state, which remains the same wherever it is. So whether it's in this country or anywhere else, and there are many, many lessons there. I want to wrap up with two questions. One is from Professor Pratap Pati, and I apologize to anybody who who I'm not able to cover here because we are really out of time. If you want your questions to be answered by Sainath, what I would urge is you email them to MAJHA House and they can send it on to him. So he will have a few hundred more emails to respond to over the weekend or whatever, because he rebels in this. But Professor Pati's question is about insured research farming, where public funded institutions can participate in trials on the lands of marginal farmers instead of doing it inside the lab. And this could be a win-win situation for both. Why not try this model? And the other question, the last one, is from Kishore Tukral. It's talked of the Congress's model law to annul, that's rather wishful thinking, provisions of the 3 Farm Acts. This is going to be passed by the Congress ruled states and some in non-India states. And there may be obviously a clash if there is, if the president withholds his assent constitutionally, then what would happen in terms of the confrontation with the states? And there are at least half the country is under non-NDA governments. So could you close with that? Thank you.
Relating to what Professor Pati has said, I'm saying those public institutions going and working on the land, instead of working in the lab, working in the lands of the marginal farmer, where are those institutions? Most of them have been devastated or decimated. Some of the leading institutions of agriculture in this country, many of their scientists are doing consultancies for the corporate sector. Many of them. Someone has to do an RTI asking every scientist of that the other non-work consultancies done in major institutions of agriculture in the public sector in India. Second, the agriculture universities. And in the agriculture universities, these were really wonderful things in the late 60s and 70s, when the kind of bonding between community and scientist and university was of the kind I believe you are suggesting. And I loved it. One of my favorite experiences of Punjab, 1978, I come to the Punjab Agricultural University in its old shape, standing with my cronies in the corridors. I come to see some friends and standing in front of the veterinary department. And a huge guy, Sardar, with very tall and with a big turban, and comes with an even more huge bull and tells the faculty that bull is ill, treat him. To their eternal credit, the faculty got up and did it. They brought out the most primitive, frightening looking instruments you've ever seen. But the thing is, that man thought of that university as his property. And good for him. It was meant to be his property. It was meant to belong to the public, and the faculty responded to that guy. They didn't think that they were doing him a favor. They thought they were doing their job. Today, you find me the farmer who goes within 1 kilometer of the agriculture university. I know the ones in Maharashtra. I've seen the ones in Andhra. In the agriculture universities, you enter one in Hyderabad, or you enter one in Andhra Pradesh. The syndicates of these universities are dominated by top input salesmen and corporations. And there will be a Rasi Silk library and Ambani auditorium. They're totally compromised. They've lost their connection with the farmer. I have been, for the last few years, telling farm groups. In my journalism also, I adopted this practice 30 years ago. I consider the farmer to be the expert on agriculture. As Sanjoy knows, when reporters go to a district, the damn first thing we were trained to do is to go and call on the collector and ask him what's happening in agriculture. That collector in Bid in Bid in district in Maharashtra, maybe someone from Tonk in Rajasthan who's been 3 months in the district, but we take him as an authority over someone who has tilled the land of Bid district for 50 years. I don't accept that. That's a very wrong-headed priority of who an expert is. So I think that I have been appealing to farm organizations. I've been appealing to farm. Start your own little research centers. I can tell you that the Kisan Sabha, All India Kisan Sabha, has started its own research centers in Telangana, in Andhra Pradesh. They were gifted 2-3 acres of land by their members, and on that they are experimenting with certain things. Looking, they will tell the farmer whether he should use this seed or not, etc., etc. So I would like that sort of thing to happen now, because I don't trust the establishment. Second, the 3 farm acts. Well, I'm glad the Congress is saying we will do something else. And I congratulate them for revising their position, because the same Congress party promised the repeal of the APMC Act in its 2019 manifesto. The same Congress party let the Swaminathan Commission reports, the finest blueprint of Indian agriculture that up to this date we have had. In 2004, December, Swaminathan submitted volume 1, first report. By 2006, he had submitted the second volume of his 5th report. And shortly after that, apart from the 5 reports of 6 volumes, he submitted a national draft policy for farmers. Who was in power there? Okay. And who was the agriculture minister? The Grand Maratha, the great farmer leader, Mr. Pawar. Since 2004, those volumes of precious work have collected dust in Parliament without a single day, a single session, a single hour of special discussion. The Swaminathan report, and now they're trying to say Shanta Kumar report, as if what Shanta Kumar produced has anything of the significance that the broad-based National Commission for Farmers report had, that the incredible consultative process it had. But for 15 years, those reports have lain on the table in Parliament. 10 of those 15 years, the Congress suppressed them, did not allow a discussion on them, despite some members of Raj Sabha asking for a special discussion. Now, if they've changed their position, I welcome it. I'm glad. I congratulate them. And should they try doing something different in the states? Well, yes, actually they should, because one of the problems with what this government has done is now the huge encroachment on federalism, the huge encroachment on states' rights. What is agriculture listed as? Yeah. But again, recognize that the violation of state rights on agriculture goes back to 1991, 92, 93. It goes back to our accession to the WTO in its present form, where are states consulted in the decisions taken by bureaucrats and corporate lobbyists in Geneva and WTO? The states were never consulted. Now with the GST, states further surrendered their major source of revenue, taking federalism from 50 years back. So this is the point. I wish that the Congress will do it. I'm hoping that they will, but don't turn around and adopt the same thing in a different, in a different cover, a book with the same book with a different cover. That will be wrong. Now, can you bring up resistance to this after these acts have been rammed through? I'm saying that whether they do it or not, resistance is going to come from the farmers. That you're going to see. Okay? It's a question, for all of us. The question is not whether resistance and change will come or not come. it will come. Our question is it going to happen outside our consent, or are we going to be within that change?
Well, Sainath, I'm also looking at the dropping numbers of people participating, but this has been for all of us truly an extraordinary experience. And I want to thank you, immensely on behalf of MAJHA House and my own personal behalf for accepting this this opportunity to share not just your thoughts and your experiences, but your deep knowledge and deep compassion about the issues that we are facing. Because it's all about rights, it's the human rights of people which are at stake here. It's not just the economic pressures on them. It's a matter of life and death for millions of people. And it is something that you helped us understand so much better with your erudition, your passion, and your compassion. So for all these great qualities and your enduring commitment to the life and lives of Indian farmers and all Indians, I pay tribute to you. And I think we should take the Swaminathan report out. We should, I need to read it again. I read briefly it some years ago, and now you brought it up. I would very much like it to be something that's discussed, not just in the media, which is not sold, but also in state assemblies and parliaments and all that, because we have a right for this to be heard. We have a right to be heard, and that report needs to be read. To say that we've only covered part of your vast knowledge and erudition, and I wish you would come back to do a second edition of this, because I think these issues you're talking about will not go away. As you said, the night will become darker before the dawn comes. But as I wrote in the AFSPA report, when I wrote not a dissenting opinion, because it was a conclusive consensus on AFSPA by the Reddy Committee, I said, at the end of the night, whether you see it or not, there is a dawn. So we all go through these situations, and we hope that things will get better as with time and with the commitment that people like you have shown. I had just one other line, and I know Preeti is waiting to have her say, is that I described you at the beginning as plowing a lonely furrow, but now you'll have company. All of us will also join you in plowing furrows, sowing seeds if we can, even if we are not farmers. And thank you for this wonderful sharing of your mind and of your universe. Thank you. I'll hand it over to Preeti now.
Okay, now finally I'm able to speak. Thank you very, very much for this evening and this absolutely wonderful session. I mean, of course, we all learned a lot, and I think also we feel extremely disappointed in the way that we are as a society. And thank you also for the easy accessibility of what you presented. It was so simple and easy to understand the entire landscape of what's going on. And you made the connections for us. I think you underlined the crisis. You decoded it for us. And calling it a civilizational crisis, I think that's the underline for me, that this is really something enormous and something, as Sanjoy said, that we all need to participate in, walk together, try and do something about what's been going on in the country. So just simply thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, audience, for being here and for being engaged. Thank you very much, Sanjoy, for taking the questions on and taking the entire discussion forward. Thank you, everybody. Good night.